You know what's actually happening in your brain when you can't stop those negative thoughts? It's not a character flaw. It's not weakness. It's neural circuits, firing in patterns that got carved deep through repetition. Right now, as you listen to this, there are specific pathways in your prefrontal cortex lighting up, reinforcing the same loops they've reinforced 10,000 times before. You think these thoughts are giving you accurate information about reality, helping you stay safe, keeping you prepared. But what if I told you that these patterns are just old wiring connections that formed under different circumstances that made sense once but are now running automatically, whether they serve you or not? For decades, I've studied the brain, worked directly with the neural tissue that generates consciousness, and here's what I discovered. Most people suffer not from their actual circumstances, but from neural patterns that became fixed at some point and then just kept running. The tragedy isn't that negative thinking exists. The tragedy is that you've mistaken automatic neural firing for the truth about your life. Let me share something that will change how you see your own mind. Most of your negative thoughts aren't really thoughts at all. They're electrical impulses following the path of least resistance through your neural tissue. When you tell yourself, "I'm not good enough," that's not some profound insight. It's neurons firing in a well-worn groove, like water running down a channel that's been carved deeper with each passing. I've spent my career studying the physical brain, and here's what the evidence shows. Your brain creates patterns through repetition, and once those patterns are established, they become your default. You're not thinking negatively because the world is negative. You're thinking negatively because your neurons have learned to fire that way, and they're very good at doing what they've practiced. A patient once came to me, suffering terribly from obsessive negative thoughts. Every morning, the same catastrophic scenarios would flood her mind, everything that could go wrong, everyone who might reject her, all the ways she might fail. "Dr. Freeman," she said, "these thoughts are destroying me. I can't make them stop." I explained something crucial to her. These aren't thoughts in the sense you think. They're neural patterns. They're circuits that got wired together through repetition, and now they fire automatically. Your brain is doing exactly what brains do, running the programs it's learned most thoroughly. When she understood this, when she realized her suffering wasn't about truth or insight, but about neural mechanics, something shifted. Not because her circumstances changed, but because she stopped treating automatic brain activity as meaningful information. She started seeing her negative thinking for what it actually was: biology, not destiny. Before we continue, if you're finding value in this conversation, I'd appreciate if you'd subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me what city and time zone you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious about who's out there listening to these ideas. Now, let me tell you what we're going to explore together in the next hour. I want to help you understand something that most people never grasp. Your negative thinking is a neurological phenomenon, not a psychological truth. It's the result of how your brain has organized itself through experience, through repetition, through the particular ways neural circuits got reinforced over years and decades. And here's the liberating part. What got wired together can be rewired. Not easily. Not instantly, but methodically, systematically, through understanding how the brain actually works. You see, I've worked with thousands of patients over my career. I've held human brains in my hands. I've mapped neural circuits. I've watched what happens when you change the physical structure of the brain, and how that changes consciousness, mood, thought patterns. And what I learned definitively is this: your thoughts are not who you are. They're products of neural activity. And neural activity can be modified. Most people who come to me are exhausted from fighting their own minds. They wake up and immediately the negative circuits activate. Today's going to be hard. You're going to fail. People don't really like you. You're not as capable as you pretend. And they spend their whole day trying to outrun these thoughts, trying to prove them wrong, trying to think differently through sheer willpower. And they're exhausted because they're fighting biology with philosophy. They're trying to argue with neurons. And here's what broke my heart. They all thought something was fundamentally wrong with them. They'd look around and see other people seemingly at ease, and they'd think, why is my brain broken? Why can't I just think normally? But what they didn't understand is that those other people's brains were also running automatic patterns, just different patterns. Patterns that happen to be less painful. It's not about broken versus healthy. It's about which circuits got reinforced and which didn't. The suffering you're experiencing right now, the frustration of negative thoughts that won't stop, the exhaustion of constant mental struggle, this isn't evidence of psychological weakness. It's evidence that certain neural pathways in your brain have become dominant through repetition. And the reason you haven't been able to change this through willpower or positive thinking is because you can't think your way out of a wiring problem. You can't overcome neural structure through intention alone. Every technique you've tried that told you to just be positive or choose better thoughts made a fundamental error. They treated thought as if it's purely voluntary, as if you can just decide to think differently and your brain will comply. But that's not how brains work. Your thoughts emerge from neural circuits that have been shaped by years of experience. Those circuits have become efficient, automatic, fast. They run before your conscious mind even gets involved. What I'm going to show you is radically different. We're not going to pretend you can simply choose different thoughts. We're not going to fight neural patterns with willpower. Instead, we're going to understand how your brain actually works, how patterns get established, and how through specific, deliberate practices, you can begin to rewire those patterns. Not by thinking differently, but by creating new neural pathways that can eventually become as automatic as the old ones. And when you understand this, truly understand it, at the level of brain mechanics, something remarkable happens. You stop fighting yourself. You stop feeling ashamed of your negative thoughts. You recognize them as neural events, not personal failings. And paradoxically, this understanding itself begins to change the patterns, because you're no longer reinforcing them with struggle and self-judgment. Right now, your brain is probably operating in one of two modes. Either you're identified with the negative thoughts, believing them, letting them determine your emotional state and your decisions, or you're in constant conflict with them, trying to suppress them, trying to think positively, exhausting your prefrontal cortex with endless monitoring and control. Both of these modes are neurologically expensive. Both of them actually strengthen the very patterns you're trying to overcome. What I'm offering you is a third approach, a way of working with your brain that's based on how neural tissue actually functions. A way of creating new patterns without fighting old ones. A way of understanding that frees you from both identification and struggle. And this approach, this is what changes everything. Because when you work with your neurology instead of against it, change becomes not just possible, but inevitable. So here's what we're going to do together. First, I'm going to explain the neuroscience of negative thinking, how these patterns form, why they persist, what's actually happening in your brain when that familiar voice starts up. Then, we're going to explore specific practices that leverage neuroplasticity, that actually create new neural pathways through deliberate action. And finally, I'm going to show you how to work with your brain over time to gradually shift which patterns dominate. But I need you to approach this with a different mindset than you've probably used before. This isn't about fixing yourself or becoming a better person or achieving some ideal mental state. This is about understanding that you have a brain, a physical organ that operates according to principles we can understand and work with. Some of what I tell you might challenge beliefs you have about mind and consciousness and free will. Stay with me anyway, because on the other side of that challenge is genuine freedom. Let me start by explaining what's actually happening neurologically when you have a negative thought. In your prefrontal cortex, there are networks of neurons that have become associated through repeated co-activation. Every time you've had a particular thought, "I'm not good enough," for instance, a specific pattern of neurons fired together. And here's the key principle. Neurons that fire together, wire together. The more often that pattern fires, the stronger the connections between those neurons become. Over time, these connections become so strong that the pattern can activate with almost no trigger. You wake up, and before you're even fully conscious, the circuit fires. You face a challenge, and immediately the associated negative thoughts emerge. You're in a social situation, and the familiar self-doubt activates automatically. This isn't you being negative. This is neural efficiency. Your brain has learned this pattern so well that it can run it with minimal energy expenditure. Now here's what most people don't understand. These patterns are not permanent. For a long time, we thought the adult brain was fixed. That neural structure was set by early adulthood. But we now know that's completely wrong. The brain maintains neuroplasticity throughout life. New connections can form, old connections can weaken, neural pathways can change. But, and this is crucial, this doesn't happen through thinking alone. It happens through experience, through action, through repeatedly engaging in new patterns until they become as automatic as the old ones. I learned this most clearly through my work with patients who had severe, intractable psychiatric conditions. Some of them had been trapped in devastating thought patterns for decades. Talk therapy hadn't helped. Medication hadn't helped. They seemed genuinely stuck. And what I discovered was that sometimes you needed to directly intervene in the neural circuits themselves to create the possibility of change. Now, I'm not suggesting that level of intervention for normal negative thinking. What I'm saying is that this work taught me something crucial. Mental states are brain states. Thoughts are neural events. And if you want to change your thoughts, you need to change your neural patterns. Not through willpower, but through systematic practice that literally rewires your brain. Let me tell you about a specific case. A man came to me who couldn't stop ruminating. Every interaction, every decision, every event would trigger hours of obsessive analysis. Did I say the wrong thing? Did they think I was stupid? Am I making a mistake? The thoughts would loop endlessly, preventing sleep, destroying his concentration, making normal life impossible. He'd tried everything: therapy, medication, meditation, cognitive techniques. Nothing stopped the loops. When I examined his case neurologically, what I saw was this. He had extremely strong circuits connecting his prefrontal cortex to his amygdala. Every neutral event would trigger the amygdala's threat response, which would then engage the prefrontal cortex in analyzing the threat, which would further activate the amygdala, creating a self-reinforcing loop. The more he tried to think his way out of the anxiety, the stronger these circuits became. The solution wasn't more thinking, it was interrupting the circuit. We needed to prevent the prefrontal cortex from engaging with every amygdala activation. We needed to create new pathways that didn't go through the rumination loop. And we did this not through changing his thoughts, but through changing his actions. Through specific practices that engaged different neural circuits, that created new patterns of brain activation, that gradually built alternative pathways his brain could use. This is what I want you to understand. You can't think yourself out of negative thinking, because thinking is itself using the same neural machinery that's creating the problem. It's like trying to fix a broken car by driving it more. What you need is a different approach, entirely one that builds new neural infrastructure. Now let me explain some key principles about how negative thought patterns maintain themselves. First, there's the negativity bias. Your amygdala, the part of your brain that processes threats, is evolutionarily biased to pay more attention to negative information than positive information. This made sense for survival. The ancestor who ignored the potential predator didn't leave many descendants. But in modern life, this bias means your brain is constantly scanning for threats, problems, dangers, and it will find them, whether they're real or not, because that's what it's wired to do. Second, there's confirmation bias. Once a neural pattern is established, once you have a well-worn circuit that generates thoughts like, "people don't like me," your brain will selectively attend to evidence that confirms this pattern, not because you're stupid or irrational, but because neural circuits that get activated strengthen, and your brain is trying to be efficient by reinforcing its existing models of reality. Third, there's the problem of neural loops. Negative thoughts often trigger negative emotions, which trigger more negative thoughts, which trigger stronger negative emotions. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where each element strengthens the others. And the more this cycle runs, the more automatic it becomes, until it can launch itself with almost no external trigger. Understanding these mechanisms is liberating because it helps you see that your negative thinking isn't a character flaw, it's your brain doing exactly what brains do. Your amygdala is protecting you. Your confirmation bias is trying to maintain a coherent model of reality. Your neural loops are simply efficient circuits that got reinforced through repetition. None of this is wrong, it's just biology. But it's biology you can work with. Let me talk now about what I call the illusion of the unified self. We experience ourselves as a single, coherent I that thinks thoughts and makes decisions. But neurologically, this isn't accurate. What we call self is actually multiple brain systems operating simultaneously, often in conflict, with consciousness emerging from their interaction. Your prefrontal cortex trying to regulate your amygdala, your reward circuits competing with your planning circuits, your verbal systems creating narratives about what your non-verbal systems are experiencing. When you have a negative thought, it's not coming from some unified you. It's emerging from specific circuits and specific brain regions that activated for specific reasons. The thought, "I'm going to fail," might be your amygdala detecting uncertainty and generating a threat response, while your prefrontal cortex is actually quite capable of handling the situation. But the amygdala's signal is strong, and it captures your conscious attention, and you mistake its activation for truth. This understanding changes everything, because once you realize that negative thoughts are just certain brain circuits activating, you can stop treating them as accurate information about reality. You can start asking, what's happening in my brain right now? Which circuits are firing? Why are they firing? What triggered this activation? And this shift from content to process is profound. I had a patient once who was paralyzed by social anxiety. Every interaction would trigger thoughts. They think I'm boring. They're judging me. I'm saying stupid things. We worked on understanding that these weren't insights. They were his amygdala hyperactivating in social situations, flooding his consciousness with threat signals. Once he understood this neurologically, he could reframe the experience. My amygdala is firing. That's what's happening. This isn't information about how people perceive me. This is information about what's happening in my threat detection circuits. This reframe didn't make the anxiety disappear immediately. Neural patterns that strong don't dissolve overnight. But it created space. Space between the neural activation and his response to it. Space where he could choose not to believe every signal his amygdala sent. And in that space, gradually, he could start building new patterns. Now let me give you some specific practices. These aren't philosophical exercises. They're neurologically based interventions designed to create new neural pathways and weaken old ones. The first practice is what I call pattern interruption through action. When you notice negative thinking starting, and you'll know because you'll feel that familiar pull, that cognitive undertow, immediately engage in physical action. Not to distract yourself, but to activate different neural circuits. Stand up. Do 20 jumping jacks. Clench and release your fists 10 times. Splash cold water on your face. The goal is to shift brain activity away from the rumination circuits and into sensory motor circuits. Why does this work? Because you can't run multiple complex neural patterns simultaneously. When you engage motor circuits strongly, it temporarily interrupts the cognitive loops. This doesn't solve the underlying pattern, but it prevents the pattern from deepening its groove in that moment. And every time you interrupt a pattern instead of following it to completion, you slightly weaken it. Do this hundreds of times, and the cumulative effect is significant. The second practice is deliberate attention training. Your brain allocates neural resources based on what you pay attention to. If you constantly attend to negative thoughts, you're strengthening those circuits. So we need to systematically train your attention to orient toward different stimuli. 3 times a day, set a timer for 5 minutes. During those 5 minutes, focus your attention on something specific in your environment, the sensation of your breath, the sounds around you, the visual details of an object. When your attention wanders to negative thoughts, and it will simply notice this happened and return attention to the chosen focus. This isn't meditation in the spiritual sense. This is attention training in the neurological sense. You're literally exercising your prefrontal cortex's ability to direct attention volitionally rather than automatically. You're building the neural infrastructure for attention control. And over time, weeks and months of practice, this changes which circuits dominate your conscious experience. The third practice is what I call behavioral activation against the pattern. Negative thought patterns often lead to behavioral withdrawal. You think I'll fail, so you don't try. You think people don't like me, so you avoid social contact. And every time you withdraw, you reinforce both the thought pattern and its behavioral consequence. The circuit becomes negative thought, withdrawal confirmation, stronger negative thought. To break this, you must act against the pattern, not randomly, but systematically. Each day, identify one small action that your negative thinking has been preventing, then do it anyway. Not because you believe it will succeed, not because you've overcome the negative thoughts, but simply to create new neural associations. To teach your brain that action can follow negative thoughts instead of withdrawal. To build circuits that bypass the negative thinking entirely. Do this consistently, and something remarkable happens. You start accumulating experiences that contradict the negative pattern. And these experiences create new neural pathways. They don't erase the old pathways, those remain as possibilities, but they create alternatives. And the more you use the alternatives, the stronger they become, until eventually your brain has multiple options instead of one automatic response. Now, I want to be very clear about something. Everything I'm describing takes time. Neural rewiring doesn't happen quickly. The patterns you're trying to change were built through thousands of repetitions over years or decades. They're not going to disappear in a week or a month. What changes relatively quickly if you do this work consistently is your relationship to the patterns. You stop believing them so completely. You recognize them as neural events rather than truth. You develop the ability to act even while the patterns are running, and over time, with continued practice, the patterns themselves begin to shift. Not because you've defeated them or fixed yourself, but because you've consistently used different neural circuits, and the brain reorganizes based on use. The negative thought pathways don't disappear entirely. Neural connections, once formed, persist, but they become less dominant. They fire less automatically. They capture your attention less completely, and you start experiencing more moments where your consciousness isn't dominated by negative loops. Let me tell you what this looks like in practice. You wake up and the familiar negative thoughts begin. Today's going to be difficult. You're not prepared. You're going to struggle. In your old relationship to this, you'd either believe it and feel defeated before the day began, or you'd fight it, trying to convince yourself otherwise, exhausting yourself before breakfast. In your new relationship, something different happens. The thoughts arise, neurons fire in familiar patterns, and you notice there's the morning negative activation. That's my amygdala engaging, my old circuits running their usual program. And you recognize this as neurology, not prophecy. You don't try to stop the thoughts. You don't argue with them. You simply let them be what they are, electrical signals, while you engage in your morning routine anyway, activating different circuits through action. This might seem like a small change, but neurologically, it's profound. Every time you notice a thought pattern, without getting caught in it, without reinforcing it through struggle or belief, you're changing your brain's response. You're building new associations. You're teaching your neural tissue that these particular thoughts don't have to determine your behavior. And this, repeated thousands of times, creates genuine change. Here's what happens over months and years of this work. The negative thoughts lose their intensity. They still arise. The neural pathways still exist, but they're quieter. They're less compelling. They capture your attention for shorter periods. And you start having more experiences where your mind is genuinely quiet, not because you've forced it to be, but because the circuits that generate negative loops aren't firing as frequently. This is neuroplasticity in action. This is what it means to work with your brain instead of against it. You're not trying to eliminate the neural patterns. That's impossible. You're creating new patterns that can compete with old ones. You're building neural infrastructure that gives your brain alternatives. And you're doing this not through thinking or understanding or insight, but through systematic practice that physically reorganizes your neural tissue. Let me share one more case that illustrates this beautifully. A woman came to me who described her negative thinking as a voice that commented constantly on everything she did. That was stupid. People are judging you. You're not good enough. The voice was so persistent, so seemingly separate from her, that she sometimes wondered if she had a split personality. She'd tried for years to silence this voice, to argue with it, to reason with it. Nothing worked. I explained to her what was actually happening. She had extremely active circuits in her left prefrontal cortex that generated verbal self-commentary. These circuits had been reinforced through years of use, probably starting in childhood when she learned to monitor herself constantly for mistakes. The voice wasn't a separate entity, it was just these circuits firing, generating their characteristic output. Understanding this neurologically changed everything for her. She stopped treating the voice as meaningful. She stopped engaging with its content. She simply recognized, those circuits are firing again. And she practiced letting them fire while she directed her attention and behavior elsewhere. She didn't try to silence them. She just stopped giving them behavioral significance. Over time, and this took many months, something shifted. The voice didn't disappear, but it became background noise. The circuits still fired, but they lost their grip on her attention. And she discovered something remarkable. She had energy and mental space she'd never had before, because she wasn't constantly engaged in internal arguments with her own neural patterns. This is what I'm offering you. Not the elimination of negative thinking that's neither possible nor necessary, but a fundamental shift in your relationship with your own neural activity. An understanding that you have a brain that generates thoughts automatically, and those thoughts are just neural events, not truth or identity or destiny. And with that understanding, combined with systematic practice, you can build new patterns that give you genuine freedom. Let me bring this all together now. Your negative thinking is a neurological phenomenon. It's the result of specific circuits in your brain that have become dominant through repetition. These circuits were shaped by your experiences, by what you learned, by how your threat detection systems got calibrated, by which neural associations got reinforced over years and decades. They're not who you are. They're not ultimate truth. They're biological patterns running in biological tissue. But you're also not helpless. Your brain maintains neuroplasticity. New circuits can form. New patterns can develop. The dominance of old circuits can diminish. Not through thinking differently, you can't think your way out of wiring, but through systematic practice that creates new neural pathways, through physical action that interrupts old patterns, through attention training that builds new circuitry, through behavioral activation that creates experiences your brain can use to build alternatives. The work isn't about fixing yourself or overcoming your brain or achieving some perfect mental state. The work is about understanding how your brain actually functions and then working with that understanding to gradually shift which patterns dominate. It's about recognizing neural events as neural events, not truth. It's about building new infrastructure through practice. It's about being patient with the biological reality that brains change slowly, but do change. I want you to imagine something. Imagine understanding at a deep level that every negative thought you have is just neurons firing in patterns they've practiced. That when the thought, "I am not good enough," arises, it's not revelation or truth, it's the same circuit that's fired 10,000 times, doing what circuits do when they're well practiced. And imagine responding to this not with belief or struggle, but with simple recognition. There's that pattern again, neurons firing, neural activity. And then imagine acting anyway. Moving forward with whatever you're doing, not because you've overcome the thoughts, but because you understand that neural activity doesn't have to determine behavior, building new circuits through action, creating new associations through practice, gradually, day by day, week by week, teaching your brain new patterns until they become as automatic as the old ones. Now imagine doing this for months, for a year, for years, each day recognizing thoughts as neural events, each day interrupting patterns through action, each day training attention toward what you choose rather than what captures you automatically, and accumulating all of this practice, all of these new neural activations, until gradually your brain reorganizes itself. Until the negative patterns are still there, neural connections don't disappear, but they're no longer dominant. They're quieter. They fire less often. They capture you less completely. This is what neuroscience offers you. Not a magic cure, not instant transformation, but a genuine, biologically grounded path to change. An understanding that your brain is plastic, malleable, capable of reorganization, and a set of practices that leverage this plasticity systematically. All you need is understanding, consistency, and patience with biological timescales. Your negative thinking doesn't mean you're broken. It means you have a brain that learned certain patterns, and those patterns became automatic through repetition. It means you have neural circuits that are doing exactly what they're supposed to, running efficiently, automatically, based on what they've learned. The fact that you're here, learning about this, wanting to change that itself, is your prefrontal cortex engaging, seeking new information, looking for alternatives. That's neuroplasticity beginning. Be patient with yourself. Brains change slowly. The patterns you're working with were built over years, reinforced thousands of times, carved deep into your neural tissue. They won't dissolve quickly, but they will change, gradually, inevitably, if you consistently practice working with your brain instead of against it. If you keep recognizing thoughts as neural events, if you keep interrupting patterns through action, if you keep training attention, if you keep behaving in ways that create new experiences your brain can learn from, and one day, maybe months from now, maybe years, you'll notice something remarkable. A negative thought will arise, and you'll observe it with complete neutrality, not fighting it, not believing it, just watching neurons fire, patterns run, activity happen. and it will have no power over you whatsoever. It will be like watching clouds pass, something happening in the field of consciousness, but not controlling consciousness, not determining behavior, not defining experience. And in that moment, you'll understand what I've been trying to tell you. You are never your thoughts. You are never the patterns running in your neural tissue. You were the awareness observing them, the consciousness containing them. And that awareness was always free, even when the patterns were strong. You just didn't know it yet. Now let me go deeper into the specific neural mechanisms that keep negative thinking locked in place, because understanding these mechanisms gives you leverage points for intervention. One of the most powerful is what we call the default mode network. This is a set of brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and temporal parietal junction that become active when your brain isn't focused on external tasks. This network is responsible for self-referential thinking, for the internal narrative about who you are and what your life means. And here's the problem. In people with chronic negative thinking, the default mode network has become biased toward negative self-reference. When your brain isn't occupied with something external, it automatically starts running negative narratives about you. I'm not good enough. My life isn't working. I'm behind where I should be. This isn't willful negativity, it's your default mode network doing what it's learned to do during rest states. This is why distraction sometimes helps temporarily. When you're engaged in a task, your task-positive network activates and the default mode network quiets down. But the moment the task ends, the default mode network springs back to life and the negative narratives resume. It's like having a radio that's permanently tuned to a station broadcasting criticism, and it turns on automatically whenever you're not actively doing something else. The solution isn't constant distraction that's exhausting and ultimately impossible. The solution is retraining the default mode network itself. And we do this through specific practices that change what happens during rest states. Mindfulness meditation, for instance, has been shown in brain imaging studies to alter default mode network activity. Not because it's spiritual or mystical, but because it trains your brain to maintain a different pattern of activation during rest states. When you practice observing your thoughts without engaging with them, which is what mindfulness actually is, you're creating a new pattern in your default mode network. Instead of automatically generating and believing negative narratives, your brain learns to generate narratives and simultaneously observe them. This creates what neuroscientists call metacognitive awareness of your own mental processes. And this metacognitive capacity is associated with specific neural circuits, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, that you can strengthen through practice. Let me tell you about another crucial mechanism, the role of stress hormones in maintaining negative thought patterns. When your amygdala detects a threat, real or imagined, it triggers the release of cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones prepare your body for action, but they also affect your brain. Specifically, they enhance the consolidation of negative memories and bias your attention toward threatening information. This made evolutionary sense. If something scared you once, your brain wants to remember it vividly so you can avoid it in the future. But in modern life, this mechanism creates a vicious cycle. Negative thoughts trigger stress hormones. Stress hormones bias your brain toward noticing more negative information. More negative information generates more negative thoughts. More negative thoughts trigger more stress hormones. The cycle reinforces itself neurochemically. This is why negative thinking can feel so overwhelming and inescapable. It's not just neural patterns, it's also neurochemistry, creating a brain state that perpetuates those patterns. Breaking the cycle requires interventions at the physiological level, not just the cognitive level. Physical exercise is one of the most powerful tools we have because it literally changes your neurochemistry. Exercise increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which supports the growth of new neurons and new synaptic connections. It reduces cortisol levels. It increases endorphins and other neurotransmitters that support positive mood states. You can't just think your way out of a neurochemical cycle. but you can move your way out of it. I had a patient who'd been in therapy for years, trying to change his negative thinking through cognitive approaches. Nothing had worked. His thoughts were as negative as ever, and now he had the added burden of feeling like a failure at therapy. When I explained the neurochemistry to him, how his chronic stress had created a brain state that perpetuated negative thinking, he understood why cognitive approaches alone hadn't been enough. We implemented a program of vigorous exercise every morning. Not because exercise makes you happy in some vague way, but because it specifically alters the neurochemical environment in which thoughts arise. Within weeks, he reported something interesting. His negative thoughts were still there, but they felt different, less compelling, less overwhelming. They'd lost some of their emotional charge. What had happened neurochemically was that by reducing his baseline cortisol and increasing his BDNF, we'd changed the brain state in which those thoughts were occurring. The thoughts themselves hadn't changed, the neural pathways that generated them were still there, but the neurochemical context had shifted, and that changed everything. This brings me to another critical concept, the difference between thought content and thought process. Most people focus on content. They try to change what they're thinking. Instead of thinking, I'm not good enough, I'll think, I am good enough. But neurologically, this often doesn't work because you're using the same thought generation process to create different content. You're using the same neural machinery, just trying to run a different program on it. What actually changes things is altering the thought process itself, how thoughts arise, how much attention they capture, how you relate to them, what you do in response to them. This is a shift from content to process, from what you think to how you think. And process is what we can actually train neurologically. We can train your brain to generate thoughts without immediately believing them, to notice thoughts without being captured by them, to observe mental content with the same neutrality you'd observe external events. This training happens through what neuroscientists call attentional control. Your prefrontal cortex has circuits specifically dedicated to directing and sustaining attention. These circuits can be strengthened through practice, just like muscles can be strengthened through exercise. And when these circuits are strong, you have the capacity to notice that a negative thought has arisen and to choose not to follow it down the rabbit hole. Not through suppression, which actually activates the thought more strongly, but through simple redirection of attention. Let me explain a specific practice that leverages this, the noting technique. Every time you notice a negative thought arising, you mentally note it. Not with judgment, not with analysis, just a simple label, thinking. You're not trying to stop the thought or change it. You're training your brain to recognize thought as thought, mental activity as mental activity. And this recognition, this metacognitive awareness, activates specific prefrontal circuits that, with practice, become stronger and faster. What happens over time is remarkable. Your brain develops the capacity to recognize thought formation in real time. You start catching negative thoughts earlier in their cycle, before they've fully captured your attention and triggered the emotional cascade. It's like developing early warning radar for your own mental processes, and the earlier you can recognize a thought pattern beginning, the more choice you have about whether to engage with it. I want to be very specific about the timeline here, because I think unrealistic expectations cause a lot of people to give up. Neural rewiring takes time. If you've had negative thought patterns for 20 years, they're not going to dissolve in 3 weeks of practice. But here's what you can expect. Within a few weeks of consistent practice, you'll notice moments of increased awareness. You'll catch yourself in a negative comment, thought pattern, and recognize it as a pattern. This is your prefrontal cortex strengthening its metacognitive capacity. Within a few months, you'll notice that negative thoughts lose some of their emotional intensity. They still arise, but they don't trigger the same cascade of feelings. This is your stress response becoming less reactive. Within 6 months to a year, you'll notice actual changes in how frequently negative patterns arise. The neural pathways are still there. They don't disappear, but they're not your brain's default anymore. Alternative pathways have become strong enough to compete. Within 2 to 3 years of consistent practice, you may find that your baseline mental state has genuinely shifted. The negative patterns still exist as possibilities, but they're no longer your dominant mode of mental operation. This is a long timeline, and I want you to understand why. Because you're not just changing habits, you're physically reorganizing your brain. You're creating new synaptic connections. You're changing which neurons are myelinated and therefore fire more quickly. You're altering the baseline activity patterns of entire neural networks. This is biological change, and biology operates on biological timescales. There's no shortcut, but the change is real and lasting because it's structural. Let me tell you about another critical mechanism: the role of sleep in consolidating neural changes. Your brain doesn't just create new connections during waking. Practice it solidifies those connections during sleep, particularly during REM sleep and deep slow-wave sleep. During these sleep stages, your brain replays the patterns it activated during the day, strengthening the synaptic connections that were used most. This is why sleep is so crucial for neural rewiring. If you're practicing new patterns during the day but not getting adequate sleep, those patterns won't consolidate properly. You're essentially trying to build new neural structure without giving your brain the time it needs to actually construct those structures. And conversely, this is why poor sleep perpetuates negative thinking. When you're sleep deprived, your prefrontal cortex doesn't function optimally. The circuits that give you cognitive control, emotional regulation, and metacognitive awareness all become less effective. Meanwhile, your amygdala becomes hyperactive, more reactive to potential threats. So you end up in a state where you have less capacity to regulate negative thoughts precisely when those thoughts are more likely to arise and feel more intense. This is a neurobiological setup for suffering. And yet, I've seen countless patients who are trying to rewire their brains while chronically sleep deprived, wondering why their practices aren't working. You can't rewire your brain without adequate sleep, any more than you can build muscle without adequate protein. It's a biological necessity, not a luxury. Now, let me address something that often confuses people: the relationship between neural patterns and genuine insight. Sometimes negative thoughts contain real information. Sometimes the thought, "this relationship isn't working," or "this job is making me miserable," is actually accurate. How do you distinguish between a neural pattern running automatically and genuine insight that deserves attention? Here's the neurological answer. Automatic patterns arise quickly, feel familiar, and are typically global and absolute. "I'm not good enough" is a pattern. It's vague, all-encompassing, and has probably arisen thousands of times in similar form. Genuine insight, by contrast, tends to be specific, contextual, and often comes with a sense of novelty or clarity. I notice that every time I talk to this particular person, I feel drained for hours afterward, is more likely to be insight than pattern. The key is developing what I call observational distance. When a negative thought arises, instead of immediately believing it or fighting it, you pause and observe it. You ask, is this thought specific or vague? Is it new information or familiar pattern? Does it suggest a concrete action or just make me feel bad? This observational process engages your prefrontal cortex in a particular way, not trying to suppress the thought, but analyzing its characteristics. And this analysis itself creates separation between the thought and your response to it. Over time, you get better at this discrimination. Your brain learns to recognize the signature of automatic patterns versus genuine insight. And interestingly, this learning happens at a level below consciousness. You don't have to consciously analyze every thought. Your brain develops the capacity to automatically flag certain thoughts as pattern probably not useful, while allowing other thoughts to receive full attention. This is neural learning at its most sophisticated. Let me talk about another dimension of this work, the social and environmental context of negative thinking. Your brain doesn't operate in isolation. It's constantly being shaped by your environment and your social interactions. If you're in an environment that's chronically stressful, if you're surrounded by people who reinforce negative thinking, if your daily life lacks opportunities for positive experiences, then no amount of neural training will overcome those environmental factors. This is where the limitations of a purely neurological approach become apparent. Yes, you can change your brain through practice. Yes, neural rewiring is possible, but your brain is part of a larger system that includes your body, your relationships, your environment, your material circumstances. Sometimes negative thinking isn't just a neural pattern that needs rewiring, it's an accurate response to genuinely difficult circumstances that need changing. I've had patients who came to me seeking help for negative thinking, when what they actually needed was to leave an abusive relationship, or quit a toxic job, or address a medical condition that was affecting their brain chemistry, or build a social support network. In these cases, trying to rewire the brain without changing the circumstances was like trying to treat an infection with painkillers. The symptom might be brain-based, but the cause is environmental, and you have to address both. This is why I always emphasize, understand the neuroscience, use the practices, rewire what can be rewired, but also look honestly at your circumstances. Is your negative thinking a pattern that needs changing, or is it a signal that your life needs changing? Often, it's both. You need to work on the neural patterns and change the circumstances. Neither alone is sufficient. Now let me share something I've observed over decades of working with the brain. There's enormous individual variation in how people's brains respond to different interventions. Some people respond dramatically to exercise. Their neurochemistry shifts quickly and noticeably. Others need months of consistent exercise to see any effect. Some people's brains respond well to meditation practices. Others find that meditation actually increases their rumination and makes things worse. This isn't because some people are doing it wrong. It's because brains are different. The basic principles of neuroplasticity are universal, but the specific pathways and mechanisms vary from person to person based on genetics, developmental history, current brain structure, and countless other factors. This is why I encourage experimentation. Try different approaches. Notice what actually changes your mental state versus what sounds good in theory but doesn't affect you. Pay attention to your own neural response patterns. Some people find that vigorous aerobic exercise shuts down negative thinking almost immediately. Others find that resistance training or yoga works better for them. Some people benefit enormously from structured meditation practice. Others do better with active mindfulness, maintaining present moment awareness while doing ordinary activities. The goal is to find what actually works for your brain, not to follow a one-size-fits-all protocol. Let me talk about one more crucial mechanism, the role of meaning and purpose in shaping neural activity. Your brain doesn't just process information, it's constantly trying to make sense of your life, to create coherent narratives, to understand what matters. And the narratives you construct shape which neural patterns become dominant. If your life narrative is "nothing I do matters," that narrative will bias your brain toward noticing confirming evidence and filtering out disconfirming evidence. If your narrative is "I'm learning and growing even through difficulty," that will bias your neural processing differently. This isn't about positive thinking or self-deception. It's about recognizing that your brain constructs reality based partly on the frameworks you give it. Two people can have objectively similar experiences, but create completely different neural patterns based on how they frame those experiences. The person who frames setbacks as evidence of personal inadequacy will wire their brain differently than the person who frames setbacks as information for adjustment. And here's what's powerful. You can consciously choose your framing, not the content of what happens, but your interpretive framework for making sense of it. This choice is itself a neural event. It's your prefrontal cortex asserting top-down control over how your experience gets processed and consolidated into memory. And every time you exercise this choice, you're strengthening specific neural circuits that support that way of framing. I had a patient who had a devastating insight about this. She'd spent years in negative thinking patterns, and she suddenly realized, I've been practicing negativity. I've been rehearsing it, getting better at it, making it more automatic. I've been training my brain in exactly the direction I didn't want to go. And this realization was paradoxically liberating because it showed her that if she could train her brain in one direction, she could train it in another. The capacity for neural change that had created the problem was the same capacity that could solve it. This brings me to a final crucial point: the role of emotional processing in neural change. Many negative thought patterns are connected to unprocessed emotions, grief, anger, fear, shame, that never got fully experienced and integrated. These emotions remain as active neural patterns that keep generating thoughts in an attempt to be acknowledged and processed. You can try to rewire your thoughts all you want, but if you're not addressing the underlying emotional patterns, you're only working on the surface. This is where neural approaches need to be complemented by emotional work. Sometimes the most effective intervention isn't another cognitive practice, but actually feeling your feelings, allowing yourself to grieve what needs to be grieved, to rage about what needs to be raged about, to be afraid of what's actually frightening. When emotions are fully felt and processed, they release their hold on your neural patterns. The circuits that were generating repetitive thoughts in service of unprocessed emotion can finally quiet down. This emotional processing is itself a neural event. It involves your limbic system, your prefrontal cortex, your autonomic nervous system, all working together to fully process and integrate emotional information. It's not separate from neural work, it is neural work, just at the level of emotion rather than cognition. And for many people, this emotional processing is the missing piece that makes all the other practices finally work. So here's the complete picture I'm offering you. Negative thinking is a neural phenomenon involving specific circuits, specific neurochemicals, specific patterns of activation that became automatic through repetition. These patterns exist in a context: your body, your emotions, your environment, your life circumstances. Changing them requires working at multiple levels: neural training through specific practices, neurochemical modulation through exercise and sleep, emotional processing of unresolved feelings, and sometimes environmental changes that address the actual sources of stress. This is complex work. It's not a simple fix, but it's grounded in biological reality, and biological change, though slow, is genuinely possible. Your brain is not fixed. Your neural patterns are not permanent. Your negative thinking is not who you are, it's what your brain learned to do, and your brain can learn differently. Not through wishful thinking or positive affirmations or fighting with yourself, but through understanding how neural tissue actually works and then systematically, patiently, creating the conditions for it to reorganize itself. The freedom you're seeking is real. It's not mystical or metaphorical, it's neurological. It's the freedom that comes from having a brain with multiple strong neural pathways instead of one dominant automatic pattern. It's the freedom of metacognitive awareness that lets you observe your thoughts without being controlled by them. It's the freedom of a well-regulated stress response that doesn't trigger catastrophic thinking at every uncertainty. It's the freedom of a default mode network that's been retrained to generate more balanced narratives about your life. This freedom is available to you. Not instantly, not without effort, but genuinely, reliably. If you're willing to work with your brain's actual mechanisms of change over biological timescales, every practice session is physical change in neural tissue. Every moment of metacognitive awareness strengthens specific circuits. Every behavioral activation against a negative pattern creates new neural associations. Accumulated over time, this is transformation at the most fundamental level, the physical structure of your brain itself. So go forward from here with this understanding. You have a brain, a physical organ with neural circuits that can change. Those circuits generated patterns that caused suffering. But those patterns aren't permanent. They're not you. They're just biology. And biology can be reshaped through practice, through understanding, through patient, consistent work with the actual mechanisms of neural change. And remember this: every moment of awareness, every practice session, every time you act against a pattern, you are literally creating new synapses, strengthening new connections, building new neural infrastructure. It's not metaphorical. It's not wishful thinking. It's physical change in physical tissue, happening at the molecular level, accumulating toward genuine transformation. You are not stuck. Your brain is not fixed. Change is not just possible, it's the fundamental nature of neural tissue. All you need is understanding, practice, and patience with biology. If this conversation resonated with you, please subscribe to continue this journey together. Leave a like if you found value here, and I'd genuinely love to read your thoughts in the comments. Share one insight about how understanding the neuroscience of thought might change your relationship to negative thinking. Tell me what you're discovering about your own neural patterns, because we're all working with the same basic biology brains that learn patterns, circuits that become automatic, plasticity that allows change. By understanding this, you're not just helping yourself. You're part of the emerging understanding of what we actually are. Biological systems with the capacity to understand and reshape ourselves. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for being willing to see your mind as what it is, neural activity that can change. The world needs more people who understand brains, who work with biology rather than fighting it. And now, you're one of them.